Good afternoon, everybody. My name is John Wiggins, Director of Services at the Drexel Libraries. Our Dean of Libraries is here with us, but she can't make it for the whole event, so she's just popping in right here at the very beginning. And it's on her behalf I'm excited to welcome you to today's events. This session is part of Countdown to Vote, the library's newest series of webinars that focuses on different topics related to voting and elections. Through these sessions, we seek to engage the Drexel community and our neighbors across Philadelphia and Pennsylvania with important issues related to elections and voting in order to help us all navigate the upcoming presidential election. We're hosting one more session before the end of the month, one that addresses the important topic of election reform. That event is scheduled for Tuesday, October 27th at 11 a.m. To register, please visit our website, www.library.drexel.edu. And stay tuned for announcements about other sessions we plan to host following the November 3rd election. Before we begin the discussion, I want to run through a few logistics. First, please keep yourself muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat, and Stacy Stanislaw, the library's communications manager, will pose them at the end of the session to continue our discussion. We're recording today's presentation, and we will post the video on the library's YouTube channel later today. Following the webinar, all attendees will receive an email with a link to that video, as well as a link to a very short survey. We would love to hear your feedback about this session and ideas for future sessions. I am now pleased to introduce Amelia Hoover Green, Associate Professor in the Department of Politics at Drexel and the inaugural Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences. Professor Hoover Green completed her PhD in political science at Yale University in 2011. Her PhD thesis and related work consider the role of political education programs and armed groups' attempts to control violence against civilians. And her more general research interests include the dynamics of violence during armed conflict, the diffusion of ideas through organizations, the political psychology of violence, and the measurement of political violence. While completing her PhD, Hoover Green also served as consultant with the Human Rights Data Analysis Group, as knowledge management expert for UN action against sexual violence and armed conflict, and as a consultant to a number of war crimes trials. Welcome, Amelia. The screen is now all yours.
All right, thank you so much, John, and also many thanks to Stacy Stanislaw, who set us up today in fine style. It's weird to be screen sharing because it means that I can't see most of you. Oh, look, I have family members here. Yay. The pandemic has brought us something at least. So I'm going to be talking I was saying to John and Stacy earlier that it's hilarious to be talking briefly about the work of Juan Lintz, who wrote the classic article, The Perils of Presidentialism, because Lintz was, let's just say, a voluminous writer, talker, thinker. He wrote a ton. And the argument, he elaborated the perils of presidentialism argument over and over again in ways that were sometimes like really ornate. I want to talk about the basics of the perils of presidentialism argument and sort of think about how and whether it applies to the US today. And in doing so, I'm going to say a few things about kind of comparative cases. So this is my teaching wheelhouse. I teach introductory comparative politics, which means I'm often talking to students who have grown up with primarily American politics and who are sort of surprised to know that there are other ways of doing things. And when we sort of apply a broader comparative lens to American politics, I think it can be really valuable. So with that in mind, I'll get started. So the first thing I want to show you is a picture of Juan Lintz. Here he is. He was still, Professor Lintz died in 2013, but he was still around when I was at Yale. And he would, occasionally show up in seminars and terrify everyone. Extremely sort of towering intellectual figure. And he had real reason to be concerned about the dangers of executive power. So Linz was born in Weimar, Germany, and he lived through at least the beginning of the Spanish Civil War and the Franco dictatorship before coming to the United States. And he had he had a number of major areas of research, but he wrote most often about the wonders of parliamentarism and the failures of presidentialism, as well as maybe his best known work is elaborating different forms of authoritarian government. So that is to say, non-democratic government. How are military dictatorships different from single party systems? How are those things different from personalistic rule? And here's the thing. By the time I got to graduate school in 2004, Linz's work was no longer on, or at least Linz's work on presidentialism was no longer on the graduate reading list at Yale in the political science department, which, is embarrassing because there he was at Yale. But that had a sort of interesting Americocentrist reason behind it, and that is that his work on presidentialism was constantly challenged, sometimes well and sometimes poorly, but very often challenged on the basis of the existence of a single, long-standing, highly successful presidential democracy, the United States. So this year, as people have political scientists in particular, have started to think about whether our system, our democratic system, is healthy, whether our democratic system is robust, there's been a kind of return to thinking about Linz's arguments. And what were those arguments? Okay, so first, I think I probably need to say something about the difference between presidentialism and parliamentarism, since parliamentarism is unfamiliar to many of us. The largest differences, at least as far as Linz is concerned, is that under parliamentarism, the head of state, usually a prime minister, is elected by the legislative body. So the entire governing mandate sits with the legislative body. So there's no such thing as divided government in a parliamentary system. As many of us who are in the US or grew up in the US know, in a presidential system, of course, those two bodies are elected separately. Now, we think presidentialism is good, by and large, because as Americans, and I'm speaking kind of on behalf of Americans, recognizing that many of you in the room are not Americans, or not even in America right now, but our presidentialist history is long. I'm showing you a tiny little image from the Federalist 70, which is Alexander Hamilton's initial argument for the presidency, although obviously the Constitution had been around for a minute before this was published. So what's good about presidentialism as opposed to parliamentarism? So thing number one, the possibility of direct democracy, the direct election of a chief executive. When there's a mandate in the population, and we're going to come back to that mandate requirement in a second, this means that the people very directly are electing the person who is sort of primarily responsible for the political life of the nation. Second, checks and balances. Those are good. We all learned that checks and balances are great, probably in elementary school and middle school and high school again, at least those of us, again, who went to school in the United States. Because the legislature and the president are elected separately, right, we have the possibility that if the president does something crazy, the legislature is going to check that or balance that, as the case may be. There's also decisiveness. The president has far more than a prime minister. The president has independent power to implement laws, or rather implement, say, executive orders. to implement governance decisions, and to do so quickly. Finally, stability. One of the things that's important about a presidential system as opposed to a parliamentary system is that a presidential system has fixed routine elections, in our case every 4 years, in many countries every 5 years. And that allows, at least Hamilton thought that allowed, for the possibility of giving a president basically a fair shot at making things work, at having enough time. People could, and also the populace can expect that an election is coming and know what the schedule is going to be. This is as opposed, of course, to a parliamentary system in which the legislature can hold a vote of no confidence at any moment, requiring a new election and requiring the selection of a new executive, a new prime minister. So that sounds good. I like those things. Directness sounds good. Checks and balances sound good. Decisiveness and stability sound good. So what is Lintz talking about in this kind of research agenda on presidentialism? That is to say, what are the perils of presidentialism? So he names 4 and kind of implies 1 in the kind of most famous statement of the perils. One is the first, and what he believed to be the most important, is this idea of competing mandates. So when a president is directly elected and a legislature is directly elected, and then those two organizations are at loggerheads for one reason or another, that may create what Linz called a regime crisis. That's different than a governance crisis, a crisis that might occur in a parliamentary democracy. It might mean that the institutions themselves are sort of at war with one another and are fighting to carry the mantle of the people's choice. And when the legislature is opposed to the presidency, you end up with the possibility that they might compete for power. Second, zero-sum elections. So elections for president are zero-sum in the sense that there's a fixed term. That person is in power. That person has considerably more independent power than a prime minister would. And consequently, it is easy for losers in a presidential election, particularly in a new democracy, to basically take the ball and go home, to say this system is never going to serve me. That's the sense in which Linz is concerned about zero-sum elections. Third, fixed terms in office. In Linz's opinion, fixed terms in office just exacerbate the zero-sum elections problem. They lead to sort of inability to move forward until the next election rolls around, in the case that mandates are competing. And finally, the sort of two final points there are kind of different sides of the same coin. One of Linz's concerns, and what I think turns out to be a really prescient concern, is that presidents will, because of their popular mandate or because of their ostensible popular mandate, I'm going to talk about that more in a minute, put a pin in it. Because of their ostensible popular mandate, presidents will begin to identify support of the president with democracy itself, or support of the president's base with the people. So this kind of identification is what I've termed incipient populism. On the polarization front, Lintz says relatively clearly that polarization is not only going to be exacerbated by, presidentialism, but actually moderation is required for successful presidentialism. And he sort of I can't tell you how odd it is to reread The Perils of Presidentialism and look at and see Lintz arguing, well, yes, it's true. It works in America because of America's moderate compromise. Presidentialism, we found out, George McGovern found out in 1972, and Barry Goldwater found out in 1964, that if you're not a moderate, the people don't really want you. And in Lintz's sort of writing, that moderation is really key. All right, so promises and perils. I'm going to move on to a couple of examples. I don't have time to discuss all of these examples. And I want to point out that while Lintz's argument is essentially that presidential systems are more prone to democratic breakdown, that can happen in a wide variety of ways. And I want to point out that it hasn't happened in the US. It hasn't happened in the US. There are some questions floating around out there about whether it is happening now and to what extent it is happening now. But so I have Donald Trump as an example of a president that, that potentially could be an example of the perils of presidentialism. But as I'll discuss in a moment, it's not an exact fit. But I want to start by talking about Salvador Allende in Chile. This was Lintz's key example in the article. And Allende is a fascinating character. He is the first Marxist ever popularly elected to the presidency. He came into the presidency with a sort of on a reformist, an extreme reformist, not a sort of communist platform, but okay, anyway. But more importantly, he comes into the presidency with, roughly speaking, 36.5% of the vote. Now, that's not a great mandate. That's actually a mere plurality. Although in a presidential system, a plurality wins, right? And what Lintz says is that in a parliamentary system, Allende would probably have been prime minister, but he would probably have needed to form a coalition around himself with actors that would be more moderate, and actors that would, this is not in Lintz, but it's sort of implied in Lintz, actors that would be less scary to the United States. Because ultimately it was the US that oversaw the coup that brought down Salvador Allende on September 11th, 1973. But Lintz does want to place some blame there. The military coup happened for Lintz because Allende was trying to sort of enact a mandate that he didn't really have. And he was doing that because of the presidential institution, according to Lintz. Now, an important thing to notice is that times have changed. So everyone else on this list has come into power in the last decade or two. Allende served in the early 1970s. All of these other folks are more recent. And the reason, at least to me, the reason that that's important is that the dynamics of democratic breakdown have changed. The dynamics of democratic breakdown have changed such that military coups of the type that ousted Allende are really decreasingly common. We don't see that many military coups. What we do see, and this is the sort of primary, or this is the main argument of a great book from a couple of years ago called How Democracies Die. Great title. That is by Steve Levitsky and his co-author Daniel Ziblatt, in case you want that. The argument there is that democracies are less likely to be brought down by, say, military intervention, either internal or external, or some kind of dramatic event, and much more likely to fall in what could be called a self-coup, a sort of slow-rolling, relatively public crisis in which a president who has been, or a leader who has been popularly elected, effectively steals the stage. So, and that is true of Nicolás Maduro in Venezuela. It's certainly true of President Erdogan in Turkey, and it is arguably true of Rodrigo Duterte. So I want to close quickly by noting some implications of Linz's argument. Successful presidentialism relies on norms. It relies on moderation. It relies on the president themselves and their sort of commitment to not just norms and moderation, but their character. And this is something that I think Linz writes about really well, that the presidency is partly dangerous because of the fact that a single person holds so much power. So what's the prognosis for the US? This is my for what it's worth, here's my professional political science opinion. So obviously a near zero likelihood of a military coup. Hooray. Very low likelihood of widespread and organized political violence around the election. High likelihood of some sporadic political violence. Medium likelihood of what I would call a constitutional crisis, in which the election result is contested and there is no moment where Al Gore decides not to fight, to use the example from 2000. High likelihood of continued polarization and animosity. And in the long term, I want to point out, just to go back to this, right? Successful presidentialism relies on norms. A key thing that has happened in the US recently is erosion of democratic norms. And that is hard to repair, partly because, right, norms are unwritten, so you can't just kind of write down new ones. So I think we are looking at a long time scale of rethinking, repairing, figuring out what to do with the presidency in sort of a general way. So that was a kind of lightning talk, but I will pause there and take questions from anyone who has questions. Ooh, hello. Go away.
Thank you so much. This is Stacy, the communications manager for the libraries, everyone. If anybody has any questions and they'd like to type them in chat, please go ahead, or you can unmute yourselves and ask directly. One just came in. If the presidential system is largely dependent on norms instead of a constitutional system of checks and balances, how is this not a constitutional crisis?
How is our current situation not a constitutional crisis? I would say, so do you want to wave at me if that's your question? No, you don't. Hi, okay. So I think, how is this not a constitutional crisis? Like, is it already? In some ways, yes. I think that one of the things that has happened in the United States over the last several years, and in fact, going back before Trump, is what's called in the literature the sort of the imperial presidency, right? So presidents have long wanted to gain more and more power for their institution and have done medium at that, have done pretty well at that in some cases and pretty poorly in others. But to the norms question specifically, I think we've seen real erosion in democratic norms, not just among elected folks, but among regular people in the last few years. And I think, I'm not sure I'd call it a constitutional crisis, because, you know, the Constitution is about perhaps control the document, but I take the point of the question for sure.
Right. Perhaps crisis wasn't the best word to use there, but my question mostly related to a kind of constitutional instability or void almost. Yeah. In the fact that if I were to reference Robert Dahl and Giovanni Sartori, you don't really see a functioning system of checks and balances for us. Instead, as you mentioned before, it's largely reliant on norms, in which cases that's something that's necessarily expected in order to see a functioning democracy. Yeah. You mentioned American exceptionalism and how we look to the United States as the sole example of a successful democracy. But if you're gauging success based on the basis of norms instead of constitutional checks and balances in a functional constitutional system, is that really an effective gauge of measurement?
Oh man, so we've now stepped outside of my personal expertise. As you heard in the bio, my expertise is, well outside of what's written. I think that, to kind of go back to Linz, and in fact also to Dahl and Sartori, that norms, Linz certainly says it, right? Moderation and norms are the key things. And one of the reasons that presidentialism is dangerous is that it sort of incentivizes bad norms. So you can get consociational compromises in a parliamentary system because you have to. You can get them in the US, but that's only because, we're nice. Any other questions?
There are a few more. The next one is actually about norms again. So what are the norms that you think are most at risk and the most difficult to restore or renormalize?
I think that the biggest norm that is at risk is the biggest norm, which is essentially the what we might call the loyal opposition norm, which is the idea that your political enemies are people who, your political enemies are not enemies of democracy, are not enemies of the country. And increasingly, I think in the United States, we see, I'm going to say both sides, and that's going to sound weird because there are many sides in the US, but both sides in our sort of two-party idea of a system, both of those sides are pretty sure right now that the other side is undemocratic. Right, so we see a lot of yelling about fascism and a lot of yelling about Antifa, and it's a whole other conversation, the sort of imbalance in the empirical truths of those two statements. But the norm is fundamentally the belief that that your enemy is not a terrorist or not even an enemy. Right, your political opponent is someone who will be your political opponent for a long time. For better or for worse. And that norm seems kind of gone at the moment. And that is, I think, the thing that I find most troubling right now.
I have two more questions. If you can stay, I know it's 1:31 right now. So if we can go over a little bit, otherwise I can always email these to you, Amelia, and we can do finish up via email. So it's up to you.
I'm good to stay.
Okay, great. Then we'll take these two more. The next one is, what do we know about how parliamentary democracies have, quote, died? Is it possible that the type of executive is less important than many commentators think?
What do we know about how parliamentary democracies have, quote, died? An interesting thing to note is that there are certainly examples out there right now of, I'm going to click back to my parade of bad outcomes here. There are certainly elected executives right now. I'm thinking particularly of Viktor Orbán in Hungary, who have gone from a parliamentary position of power to to a sort of democratic backsliding or democratic erosion. And I think it's, Lintz would say, and I would agree, that it's about incentives. The fact of the matter in Hungary, for example, is that when Viktor Orbán came to power, he had a large majority of his party in power, and they were able to push through a lot of reforms that were quite unfriendly to democracy because of having that strong single party majority. So yeah, I think it's entirely fair to say the type of executive is one thing. It is not the thing. And in fact, a lot of the literature in political science will tell us that it is has much more to do with opportunity costs to sort of everyday actors, or it has much to do with, this is a less popular proposition these days, but something in the political culture that is inimical to democracy somehow. So I think it would be foolish to kind of be like, yep, presidentialism is the problem. But in fact, there's like a wide array of things. The problem of presidentialism is, for better or for worse, one of sort of misplaced incentives. It's easier to feel like you have to walk back democratic norms or democratic values in order to get done what you need to get done.
Great, thank you. Then one more. Parliamentary systems are sometimes described as not having separation of powers. Why should we consider legislative appointment of the executive to violate separation of power, but not say executive appointment of the judicial branch?
That's such a good question, and one that I haven't thought about in exactly those terms. I'm not good enough at the comparative politics of the judiciary to answer this question for real. But honestly, when we talk about separation of power, I would punt. I would say separation of powers, checks and balances, things like that are part of a kind of high school civics, US-centric view of governance that is, I would say, less common in the political science literature now, which is not a good excuse for why I haven't thought carefully about that, but it is the excuse I'm going to give. Yeah, I am not sure how I would answer that without going into many, many specifics about how the judiciary gets appointed in various different countries and the intersection of the judiciary with federalism and so on and so forth. But yeah, I will just stop there.
Great, thank you so much. That looks like that's all the questions that we have. So with that, I will say thank you again to Amelia. I'm going to put a quick link in the chat to the final event that we have as part of our Drexel Vote series, and that is on Tuesday the 27th with Jack Santucci, who joined us today. So thanks for being here.
Thanks, Jack.
And everyone else, and we hope to see you next week too.
All right. Thank you so much, Stacy. Thanks everyone.
Amelia. Thank you.